I see we lost some people during lunch, but welcome to all of you who returned. This is the panel, as you already know, I'm Katalin, Kádár, Lynn. This is the panel on Exile support programs of the Free Europe Committee. And I just have a few words to say about these programs, as they have been a topic of my primary research for any number of years. It would have been hard to imagine at the founding of the National Committee for Free Europe in 1949 that the exile support programs that it initiated and supported would become such diverse and far-reaching within a few years. Although the key organizations receiving support were the national committees or councils of the captive nations, and the organizations that were known as the Internationals, the International Peasant Union, the World Trade Unions in Exile, and the Christian Democratic Union. There were also financially supporting the Mid-European Study Center, the Assembly of Captive European Nations, as Anya has so thoroughly outlined in her talk, and the Free European University in Exile. All of those were underwritten by National Committee for Free Europe. Eventually, there were hundreds of programs and organizations that were supported or evenly entirely funded by the Free Europe Committee. The organization changed its name to the Free Europe Committee in 1954. These programs range from the arts to sports. Organizations such as the Philharmonia Hungarica, a symphony orchestra, a youth symphony orchestra, was funded by the Free Europe Committee as an example. Just for local interest, as of 1959 in Western Europe, there were 50 Polish organizations that were funded. In Germany, Austria, and France, there were 50 Polish organizations that were funded by the Free Europe Committee. So their range was very wide, and they touched all aspects of emigre life. While there's a large body of scholarship related to the history of Radio Free Europe, which by the mid-1950s became the dominant division of the National Committee for Free Europe, both in visibility and in terms of budget allocations, for reasons that have been eloquently presented by several of our speakers already, there was until the mid-1990s a dearth of scholarship related to the non-radio activities of the organization. The reason for that were a combination of causes. First, that the exile support programs had, by virtue of their purpose, targeted refugees and their immigrant communities. These programs were implemented by exiles for exiles. Scholarly interest in them was limited. Secondly, much of the archival material had been poorly preserved, destroyed, or if in existence, much of it remained classified or unavailable for research. Thus, the archival material was a challenge to access, if at all available. Thirdly, and most telling, scholarly interest was simply not there, as these organizations, while supported by the Free Europe Committee, even if they existed prior to the formation of the organization at the onset of the Cold War, you have to remember that 4 of the national councils were actually formed 2 years prior to the formation of the Free Europe, National Committee for Free Europe Committee, and were financially supported by the United States State Department. They seemingly had not affected U.S. policy enough to make them worthy of study. What changed? First, some eminently readable, well-researched works appear, such as Walter Hickson's volume Propaganda, Culture, and the Cold War, published in 1997, Francis Stone Saunders' work on the Congress for Culture of Freedom in 1999, Hugh Wilford's book on the CIA, and on the public-private nature of the organizational dynamic of the Free Europe Committee. In 2000, the majority of the RFE archives were acquired by the Hoover Institution, and the corporate records of the parent organization were at last available, not in their entirety, but in a large enough scope in order that the various aspects of the Free Europe Committee operations could be studied. In addition, over time, key materials related to the formation and operation of the FEC were slowly declassified, much of it, thank you to Ross Johnson, and made available to researchers. Perhaps most importantly, in the past decade, emerging scholars have chosen topics related to the FEC and its programs for their research. Scholars such as the members of this panel came on the scene and began intensive research on some of the institutions that comprised the most significant exile programs. The national councils or committees, often called committees of national liberation, by the way, represented the captive nations which had become Soviet satellites. And several presentations have mentioned Joseph Grew. His first press release regarding the formation of the National Council for a Free Europe, National Committee for a Free Europe stated, "The promise which we gave at Yalta remains unredeemed." Emigre leaders were intended to be in the forefront of the psychological warfare thrust to liberation, which in Grew's words, quote, "We have definite self-interest in helping to keep alive and in full vigor political leaders who share our view of life." And even in a few years after the organization was founded, there was still talk of liberation. Robert Lang referred to the national committees as, in 1952, as cold storage reservoirs for the day of liberation. So regardless, and we've heard about this quite a bit, regardless of the dysfunctional nature of most of the national councils, they did perform valuable and long-lasting service on behalf of their countrymen, both in exile and their homelands. And it is on a local level that they were the most effective with their refugee services, the relocation services they offered. Malcolm Proudfoot, in his seminal work on the post-war immigration and the DP programs, says over 1,039,000 DPs were relocated, almost 400,000 of them in the United States by the International Refugee Organization. These were all clients of the refugee aid services that were provided by these various national councils. And I think in this way, this was the positive contribution that they were able to make, regardless of some of their organizational problems within. Today, you will hear a presentation on the Council for Free Czechoslovakia from Francis Raška, the Baltic Freedom Committees from Jonathan Humidou, and the Romanian National Council. You will also hear from Veronika a presentation on the Free European University in Exile in Strasbourg, France, which was intended to take a different thrust by providing higher education opportunities and political orientation for refugee students. In addition to educating younger emigres, the intention of the FEC was to develop future leadership that could return or be returned to their homelands, as they could see their exile leadership aging and becoming increasingly irrelevant the longer they were in exile. All of our scholars today have been working on their research for upwards of a decade and have published scholarly papers and books related to the research they are presenting. You have the biographies in your packets. Please review them. You will be impressed by everyone's dedication and scholarship. Today's panelists also contributed to the compendium of the inauguration of organized political warfare, which is out in the book table, which I will recommend to you, even though I am its editor. So without any further ado, I will turn it over to Francis Raška. We're going to do a reverse order to the program, and Francis will speak first. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank Katie and, of course, Anya and Ross for making this possible, the conference. This morning, when we had our first panel, a song came into my head. And the song is by a band called Chumbawamba, British band. And this one line got to me, and I think it fits this kind of history very well. It reads, "There's stuff dressed up as truth, and there's stuff dressed up as lies, and it all ends up as stuff that you can buy." I won't go further. But the exile, the Czechoslovak exile, was based on a myth, okay? It was based on a myth of an ideal Czechoslovak society. In the beginning, it was dominated by people who themselves contributed to the ultimate result, which was the communist takeover in 1948. I refer to the parties of the so-called National Front, which was formed in Czechoslovakia upon liberation in 1945, When this National Front was formed, other pre-war political parties, perfectly democratic parties, were not allowed to exist. Well, 1948 came along, 25th of February was the communist putsch, or takeover, or victorious February, whichever way you want to look at it. Keep in mind, one person's truth is another person's lie. But there was this myth that had been built over the previous 3 years about how the people who were legitimated after 1945 and were allowed to participate in the so-called democratic political process in Czechoslovakia, how they were the real heroes. They were the real anti-fascist fighters, the ones who suffered and everything. Well, of course, myths that are built at home transfer over into exile. So when these people left, some of them left and had to be in refugee camps, others were housed in places like the Alaska House in Frankfurt. They thought, oh, we must start our exile work, and we should start in Britain, for example. Well, I will give you 2 quotes which will show you how welcome these people were. Foreign Office official Mayhew: "My own view is that this is the thin end of the wedge, and that if we do not intend to use Czech refugees for propaganda and intelligence purposes, we would not be wise to open our doors to these Czech MPs." His colleague, CFA Warner, was even more to the point. "I think most of these MPs will drift on to America before they become out of date and therefore valueless, and have become much of a nuisance here." Indeed, on to America they went. Now, I'm not going to bore you with the details of the National Committee for a Free Europe and how it helped to found the Council of Free Czechoslovakia, because that all you can read in my books that have been published in the English language. What I want to get into is to the themes that made the task of the Czechoslovak exile much more difficult, if not impossible. Number one, there was the problem that there was an insistence by the head honchos, the main politicians, that this exile organization, the Council of Free Czechoslovakia, was going to be organized along the lines of political parties. Oh yes, but not all the people who emigrated after 1948 had the privilege to serve in Czechoslovak political structures after 1945 because they belonged to the pre-war parties that had been banned. Alas, the first conflict develops. The next conflict was alluded to in the talk by Anna on Radio Free Europe, dealing with the infamous Slovak issue, right? The issue of Czech-Slovak relations, how you would distribute power along ethnic lines, and what have you. Then, of course, you had the problem as to who got and who didn't get from the Free Europe Committee. The key person here was one of the first people in Radio Free Europe, Ferdinand Peroutka, who was on the council, and he basically decided who was going to get to speak on Radio Free Europe in the early 50s and who was going to get one of the generous stipends for speaking. And of course, the archives show that exile is not a place for mere unity and love and peace and gathering. No, it's a place for hatred, revenge, almost political war. This bickering and endless infighting among members of the Council of Free Czechoslovakia resulted in a number of splits. The Free Europe Committee got so fed up with the Council of Free Czechoslovakia that they terminated all support in 1957 because they deemed that the differences between the different factions, and that's exactly what they were, factions, even referred to as tribes or packs by some of the participants, their differences were irreconcilable. So the Council of Free Czechoslovakia would split in 1961 into a Committee of Free Czechoslovakia and a Council of Free Czechoslovakia, would not reunite until 1974 under the apt and noble leadership of Professor Mojmír Povolný, who, besides being the president of the council, the renewed council from 1974, almost until his death several years ago, he actually was a professor of political science at Lawrence University in Appleton, Wisconsin. Now, basically, the council was reformed from 1974 onwards, that the concept of political party representation was scrapped altogether. Why? As Povolný had to explain to some of his stubborn colleagues, there would be no representation based on political parties because these parties had not properly existed since the communist coup, and times had moved on in the last 3 decades. The Council of Free Czechoslovakia initiated contacts with the already mentioned emerging dissident movement in Czechoslovakia in the 1970s, Charter 77, maintained this contact throughout the 1980s, but the stubbornness of the younger post-48 generation did not allow them to cooperate productively with the people who left after 1968 because they were deemed, and many of them actually were, former communists, evil people, godless, the words used to describe others really know no limits in the correspondence that I've read in the archives. But an inability to work together, an absolute almost intolerance of one faction versus another, before that one political party versus another, resulted in an ineffectiveness of the Czechoslovak exile. It could have been much more effective than it was, but unfortunately, history turned out otherwise. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francis. And Marius Petraru is going to share with us his work on the Romanian National Council. Thank you, Marius.
Najpierw, jeżeli jest możliwe, chcę odpowiedzieć coś po polsku, ponieważ Polska dla mnie jest jak drugi kraj. I'm going to speak in English anyway, but just a few words because, again, I feel like being at home when I came to Poland. I have a heart, I have a big feeling, for this country. And thank you again, for University of Gdańsk. Thank you, Dr. Anna Mazurkiewicz, for this conference, and Professor John Ross, once again, thank you for doing this. I'm going to have, just to introduce a little bit about, the history of the Romanian National Councils. This subject was never was developed in the last couple of years. Doesn't exist any work in English about the history of the Romanian National Councils and the relations with the Free Europe Committee, and especially about the funds provided by the State Departments and the private funds which exist to the beginning of the formations of the Romanian National Councils. And with the big exile immigrations of the Romanian after 1945, in 1949, most of the political leaders, they unite in Washington, D.C., and they decide to form the Romanian National Councils. When they start their activities, they have a few very important funds. One of the funds was the Romanian National Fund, which later was known as the Alexandru Crețeanu Fund. And this fund was established before the World War II. And this fund emerged in 1942, 1943, when the political leaders from Bucharest, they realized the imminence for the occupations of Romania by the Russian troops. And they decided to form a private fund in Switzerland. It was an account like almost 20 million Swiss francs. And from those 20 million francs, we have 8 million liquid Swiss francs and 12 million in gold. And besides this fund, there were also special funds which remain in the accounts of the Romanian ambassadors in Lisbon, Madrid, and Ankara. In Ankara, Alexandru Crețeanu, which was the former minister of Romania in Turkey, had access to an account, the amount of $1 million Swiss francs, which was like $235,000. Brutus Costa in Lisbon, he had access to almost $100,000, and Scarlat Gheorghiu in Madrid had access to almost $165,000. When in 1945, Constantin Vișoianu, which was part of the latest government led by the Radescu, he decided to transfer 6 million Swiss francs from this account to Alexandru Crețeanu. Well, the Romanian communist leaders, they found out about these secret funds which was transferred to Alexandru Crețeanu, and they want to recover the whole amount of money. But, and of course, in October 13, 1945, the Romanian regime, they gave power to an attorney in Bern to a Swiss lawyer to block the Crețeanu account and start legal action in order to recover the account assets. So this was the first one, and it lasted till the 1952. But right before the account to be unblocked, in the fall of 1952, Radescu, which was the first leader of the Romanian National Council, after the split of the Romanian National Councils in 1950, he sent to court in Bern, he sent a letter, and he sued again Crețeanu, and he wants to block the Crețeanu's fund, and he wants to recover all of the money from Crețeanu. And the second suit against the Crețeanu lasted till 1957, when the court ruled again in his favor. Then Constantin Vișoianu, the president of Romanian National Committee, found out in December 1970 about the 3 million Swiss francs in the Crețeanu account being unblocked. It was also in December 1970 that Crețeanu stopped financing some of the expenses of the committee, as had done before. This being the situation, Vișoianu asked that the fund to be transferred to a board of trustees who will manage the fund. Vișoianu's request was denied by Crețeanu, who declared that after his death, the person in charge with the management of the fund will be his wife, Elise Crețeanu. Anyway, after in 1980, after his death, we don't know absolutely nothing what's happened with this fund, and his paper at the Hoover Institutional Archives, it's blocked to the public, will be opened in 2020, and probably we're going to find more information about what's happened with these secret funds, which was in his administration. But besides this, we have another private fund which was used by the National Romanian Committee right starting with 1949. This is the Alexandru Totescu Fund, also known as the Lisbon Fund. The Alexandru Totescu Fund was a source of emergency financing available to the committee. Since the United States Department had not yet allocated funds to be dedicated to the Romanian National Committee activities, and since the situations of the refugees and of the Romanian students in Germany and in Paris was considered critical, the committee asked Alexandru Totescu, charged the affairs of the Romanian legations in Lisbon, to make available the fund that was under his administration. And its value of about $140,000 was later supplemented by another $170,000 from the Romanian legations in Madrid. The funds were managed by Alexandru Totescu according to the payment orders emitted by the National Committee. The greatest part of the funds being utilized to found the Carol I University Foundations from Paris. And this fund covered the budget of the foundations till 1955. Also, some of these funds covered the expenses of the Romanian refugees from Paris, Rome, and Geneva. Towards the end of 1955, the Lisbon Fund was exhausted, lacking the necessary resources to cover the budget of the Carol I University Foundation from Paris or fund other projects started by the committee. However, the most important financial support available to Romanian National Council until its dissolution was the one from the National Committee for Free Europe. Those funds were available starting from the summer of 1949. At the beginning, it was a small amount, but later on, starting with November 1st, the State Department supported the Romanian National Committee activities, and they pledged, with almost $16,000 per month. It was a huge sum of money for one of the National Committee activities. From those $16,000 per month expenses, almost $7,000 were for the expenses within the United States, $3,000 for the representatives and agencies of the committee abroad, $1,800 for the committee newspaper in Romanian, and $4,000 for refugee assistance. And the entire amount was transferred to the Romanian National Committee account at Union Trust Bank in Washington. Yeah. I have, all of these, the details, amazing details, of those funds and how they've been used by the committee. But the relations between the Romanian National Councils and the National Committee for Free Europe was one of the best relations just between 1949 till the fall of 1950s. On October 1950s, with the split of the Romanian National Council, then the relations between those two organizations become, very unsuccessful, and then the State Department, well, despite these divisions of the committee and the crisis created by the resignations of some key members of the leadership, they stopped to support the Romanian National Councils. So almost for 1 year, they didn't receive any funds. And there was, one of the hardest part of the activities of the Romanian National Councils. So the National Committee for Free Europe cut off all subsidies, refusing even to pay the rent of the office premises rented in Washington, and also the salary of the handful of the personnel that had been hired with the concurrence of the National Committee for Free Europe to work in Washington. But surprisingly, in the meantime, National Committee for Free Europe, they continued to subsidize the other group, which was split from the Romanian National Council, led by the General Rodescu. And they provide both the rent and salaries for the New York office, which had been arbitrarily preempted by General Rodescu with the entire approval of the same National Committee for Free Europe. In December 1950, the National Committee for Free Europe resorted to a camouflage solution in the matter of the subsidies granted to General Rodescu and his group for their New York offices, in the sense that those offices were passed on to an organization for the refugee assistance, headed by Nicolae Caranfel. So starting with the 1950s till the beginning of 1962, there were back and forth letters and requests, especially by the Vișoianu, requesting more funds and trying to convince the National Committee for Free Europe and the Free Europe Committee for more assistance. And then I just want to point out, finally, describing the situation of the Romanian National Councils and the whole financial situation, in one of the letters Vișoianu to the Romanian representatives in Paris, he described exactly this situation, and I quote, "On the other hand, National Committee for Free Europe requests that each member of the committee continue to show positive results. They did not want to provide funding before receiving from me a list of all the tasks each member of the committee has, as well as my guarantee that this task will be fulfilled. Please believe me that I encountered great difficulty, and it took a lot of work to reach an agreement with Free Europe, and it's not yet over. The result is that our committee will be closely supervised by Free Europe Committee regarding its internal solidarity and its activity." 10 years later, the committee was faced with the same financial difficulties and repeatedly asked Free Europe Committee for support. The crisis that emerged in the spring of 1963 in the relations between the Free Europe Committee and the Assembly of the Captive European Nation also left its mark on the National Committee's activities. So on June 7, the chairman of the Assembly of the ACEN, Vasil Germanji, was summoned by Albert Kappel, director of the Exile Relations Divisions of the Free Europe Committee, and advised that monthly Free Europe Committee grant to cover the regular or fixed expenses of the ACEN and its overseas representations will be reduced as of July 1st, 1965, from amount $16,000 to about $8,000 a month, 50% reduction higher than the cut in Free Europe Committee's overall budget. The philosophy of the officials of the Free Europe Committee is best expressed in a statement repeatedly made by the Albert Kappel, that, it means you and ACEN, are free to hold and express any opinion, but not on our money. Yeah. And just, to conclude is that the dissolutions of the Free Europe Committee support was the prelude to the cessations of the Romanian nationalist activities. From 1972 on, it continued its activities anemically through self-funding and sporadic donations it received for the continued publications of the Romanian. In conclusions, although the Romanian National Committee had substantial financial funds compared to the other national committees who were deprived of such sources, and still throughout several projects, it failed to unify and consolidate the actions of the Romanian exiles in its fight for the liberations of Romania from under the communist regime.
Thank you. And now we turn to Jonathan Homidou, who will speak on the Baltic Freedom Committees.
Good afternoon. Thanks. So, earlier this week, the American president was in Tallinn, Estonia, in which he gave a fairly unequivocal speech that the United States stood behind its Article 5 commitments to the 3 Baltic states in light of recent events throughout East Europe. Over the course of the last 100 years, however, American policy towards the Baltic states has been far more ambivalent. In the context of the First World War, as Woodrow Wilson was espousing the virtues of national self-determination, the U.S. was one of the last countries to officially recognize the independence of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. In 1940, after the Roosevelt administration proclaimed that the U.S. would not recognize the Soviet annexation of the 3 Baltic states, 3 years later at Tehran, Roosevelt basically tacitly accepted the fact that the Baltic states would be in a Soviet sphere of influence after the war. As a result of the Soviet occupation, for much of the 20th century, relations between those from the Baltic states and the United States worked through exile communities. And this brings to the question the role of the Baltic Freedom Committees, specifically the relationship between Baltic exiles and then the activities of the Free Europe Committee. Now, after much debate in 1950 into 1951, the National Committee for Free Europe allowed Baltic consultative panels to come into existence before there were actual official Baltic Freedom Committees. Now, the main objectives of the Baltic consultative panels in 1951 were threefold. First, to eventually work towards radio broadcast through Radio Free Europe. Second, to promote the liberation eventually of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And third, to promote unity amongst all of the various exiles in the Estonian, Latvian, and Lithuanian emigration. Now, if we look back upon these three objectives, all of them failed. Radio broadcasts would not begin until the 1970s and then transferred to Radio Free Europe in the 1980s. The liberation of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania did not take place until the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and the Baltic states were able to re-exert their independence. And also, there was little in the way of promoting unity amongst the Estonian, Latvian, and Lithuanian emigration, notwithstanding any aspects of promoting all three nationalities acting together within the emigration. So this brings us to the question of, so what? An early advisor of mine said, if you're going to look at the history of three small countries, you should be able to put them in somewhat of a larger framework so that people are actually interested in it besides those from those countries. So what I would like to talk about are 4 points or 4 themes that are very much part of the Baltic narrative in terms of the Baltic Freedom Committees, but are applicable to all sorts of scholarship dealing with the activities of the Free Europe Committee or dealing with issues of exiles and the Cold War. The first one of these deals with the question of policy guidance from the State Department as it pertains to the activities of the National Committee for Free Europe and eventually the FEC. Much has been made about policy guidance concerning Hungarian radio broadcasts after 1956. However, an earlier example in which there was very strict policy guidance from the State Department about the activities of the National Committee for Free Europe dealt with what this might mean concerning the continued non-recognition of the Soviet annexation of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Initially, in 1949-1950, there was great policy concern about the actual establishment of Baltic consultative panels because of what this might mean for the continued recognition of the Latvian and Lithuanian legation in Washington, D.C., and the Estonian Consul General in New York. There was an argument made that because the United States continued to recognize so-called democratic representatives from these countries, that there was no need to use resources in order to organize the emigration from these three countries within the auspices of the NCFE, and that what's more, if these consultative panels did come into existence, that perhaps they might ultimately undermine the role of the existing diplomats in Washington and New York. As a result of this, as there were discussions in 1950 and 1951 about the establishment of these panels, the Estonian, Latvian, and Lithuanian diplomats in Washington and New York were very much consulted in terms of whether or not they would allow these organizations to come into existence, and also what the composition of these panels might look like. One of the major concerns that the Baltic diplomats had was to ensure that these consultative panels would not duplicate any of the activities that the diplomats had. And much of this dealt with official recognition. All right? So there was great discussions between the diplomats and the National Committee for Free Europe and the State Department as to what this actually means. So the Latvian and Lithuanian and Estonian diplomats suggested individuals who would be appointed to these panels and ultimately reached an agreement that they would not duplicate the efforts of the legations. However, they could play a role in helping to organize the emigration in a broader sense. So this first point, that there were very clear policy guidelines from the State Department, was very much applicable to the Baltic question. Now, this played a role in terms of the question of radio broadcast to a certain extent. However, it was largely funding as to why these broadcasts did not begin in the 1950s and took place much later on. The second point that I would like to talk about briefly deals with some contradictory aspects of the official mission of these consultative panels, which I think is applicable to much of the activities of the Free Europe Committee, particularly outside of the radio broadcasts. On one hand, they wanted to promote the liberation of the homelands. Also, there was a question of promoting unity amongst all of the emigration. I would make the argument that these two things are inherently contradictory. It was virtually impossible to try to have even the rhetoric of liberation floating amongst all of the exile groups in the United States and Europe, while at the same time to promote unity amongst all of the groups. Now, why was this the case? Well, from the perspective of exiles residing in the United States and also exiles residing in Europe at this point in time. If the general idea was that there would be the liberation of the Baltic states in a relatively short period of time, their ultimate goal would be to return home and to exert some sort of influence on the political situation. Well, much in politics, it becomes a zero-sum game amongst competing parties. One of the things that exacerbated the tensions amongst the Baltic exile communities in a broad sense dealt with the history of the interwar years and World War II. Now, in 1940 going onwards, the United States recognized the continued existence of the interwar republics through the diplomats that were present within Washington. After the end of World War II, these were diplomats from the American perspective who represented the democratic side of things. Well, for many leading Estonian, Latvian, and Lithuanian political elites from the 1920s and 1930s, the diplomats from the late 1930s were anything but representing democratic states. So this became an issue between who would ultimately be able to be part of the consultative panels, what would the future of the Baltic states look like if they were liberated in the long term. Another thing deals with geography. Much of the Free Europe Committee's activities in promoting the consultative panels occurred within the United States. Now, the largest Latvian and Lithuanian communities were in the United States. However, the largest Estonian exile community was not in the United States, but was in Sweden. And by 1955, there were great tensions that exist geographically. One leading Estonian exile residing within Stockholm complained to American officials that you are funding lots of activities within the United States. However, us Estonians that are geographically closer to Estonia, closer to the Baltic states in Stockholm, are being left out of this, and that those who are in the United States are losing touch in terms of what is occurring within Europe. So again, I would make this argument that these contradictory aspects of unification as well as liberation played a major role in terms of why there was a failure, particularly on the context of these consultative panels, to promote broad unity amongst the emigration in a broad sense. Another point, according to this, is that the number of individuals early on was relatively low. So it was agreed that there would be 7 Latvians, 7 Lithuanians, and then 5 Estonians. That would be the core of these panels that were supposed to be representative of the emigration in a broad sense. Well, there were clearly more than 7 or 5 various political entities in the entire Estonian, Latvian, or Lithuanian exile emigrations. The third point that I would like to make is that much of the study of the Free Europe Committee's activities is about the transfer of information from the free world behind the Iron Curtain. Something that also is important deals with information activities that the Free Europe Committee were involved with that had a direct implication for audiences, particularly within the United States. Now, I know that William Cummings' book on the Crusade for Freedom is very important in this aspect. But 2 activities that were actually quite successful for the Baltic consultative panels had an impact on the dissemination of information about the Baltic states within the United States. The first one of these was a quarterly journal, the Baltic Review, that was one small vehicle in which there was meaningful cooperation amongst all 3 Baltic groups during the 1950s. But it was primarily geared towards an American audience, about educating American scholars and the general public about the history of Estonia, the history of Latvia, the history of Lithuania. Another important aspect in 1952 going forward was the Baltic States Freedom Day, which took place in June, in which there were demonstrations in New York, there were festivals that took place, and declarations made by leading politicians. And I would argue that this played an important role of educating an American public about what was taking place concerning the Baltic states. And I think looking back in the big picture of history, this is relatively significant. In 1940, when the Soviet Union annexed these 3 independent countries, there were actually many members of Congress that argued, well, this is entirely natural, that they belong within a Russian sphere of influence. Well, later on. And we can't associate all of this with the activities sponsored by the Free Europe Committee, but it would be impossible to think of any leading politician in the West or in the United States arguing that these three successful independent countries somehow belong in any particular sphere of influence, except maybe broadly defined as European today. So I think looking at these activities in terms of their ability to influence Western audiences is something that is important. And the final point or theme that I would like to discuss is that failure is not necessarily always a bad thing. As I started with, I said that the original consultative panels were not successful at initiating radio broadcasts. They were not initially successful in the short-term liberation of the Baltic states, and they were not particularly successful in promoting unity amongst all of the exiles throughout the West. However, what is important about these failures is that the following generation of Estonian, Latvian, and Lithuanian exiles, as well as émigrés, looked back at what took place in the late 1940s into the 1950s and saw what didn't work. And as a result, there was a greater flexibility in terms of understanding their role within Western society compared to their relationship to their home country. There was a willingness to work together and put aside any sort of partisan differences that might have occurred within an earlier generation. And also, there were new strategies that were put in place. And as we know, change would not take place within the Soviet Union and the Baltic states until conditions on the ground actually warranted it. However, there was a real concern in the 1960s that perhaps the fate of the Baltic states would simply go unnoticed as the first generation of exile became older, as they ultimately became less relevant in terms of the general Cold War. After all, in 1940, the Baltic states was one of the first blatant examples of Soviet aggression. But by the time we get to the 1960s, there are a myriad of other examples that resonate more, whether it might be Hungary in '56, Czechoslovakia in 1968. In fact, there were many people within the State Department at the mid-level who actually discussed openly, how is it that this non-recognition policy could somehow be wound down, as far as ruled somehow not as relevant as it once might be. However, the lessons learned from this early period, I think, instructed a next generation of Baltic exiles and émigrés to pick up where the first generation had left off, and played a significant role in, particularly in the late 1980s, in the reestablishment of independent states in 1991. So, with that, thank you.
Now we leave the national councils, national committees, and we turn to Veronika Durin-Hornyk's paper on the Free European University in Exile. That's hard to say. Thank you, Veronika.
So the Free Europe University in Exile was the fellowship institution of the Free Europe Committee. It was founded in 1951, and its last operation took place in 1965. During this 14 years of existence could be divided into two main parts. So the first part is the so-called Free Europe University in Exile. That was the name of the educational corporation of the Free Europe Committee. The aim of this institution was to assist East European young refugees who were already living in Western Europe, to make them able to follow university studies, which has been interrupted because of the communist takeover in their native countries. This educational corporation, so the Free Europe University in Exile, was phased out in 1958, but 1 year later, the Free Europe Committee decided to relaunch the fellowship program under the name of the Free Europe Scholarship Fund. This fellowship program was completed by a large scale of joint operations, which were labeled together youth activities. These activities, which were running until 1965, were carried out by the committee's Western European Operation Division. This division was based in London. And the youth activities, which were carried on in the 1960s, targeted not only Eastern European, but also students from the Third World. That was mainly students from Africa and from Latin America, but also students from Asia. So these 14 years of existence about the Free Europe University in Exile and its follow-up fellowship program, it's a story about a very ambitious cultural endeavor, because the main aim of the Free Europe Committee was to form a future leadership in case of collapse of communist regime behind the Iron Curtain. Even in the 1960s, when the policy of liberation has been already a long time even forgot, the motto of the fellowship institution was to influence tomorrow's leaders. Tomorrow's leaders among Eastern European students, to continue to westernize them. When the countries will be liberated, they can contribute to introduce democracy, and also influencing tomorrow's leaders in the Third World, just because the 1960s, that was about the struggle actually for the uncommitted areas in the Cold War. So this being said, I would like to give you a general overview on the history of the Free Europe University in Exile, and I would like also to stress a little bit its place in the Free Europe Committee's framework. So the Free Europe University in Exile was created in France, in Strasbourg, and the choice of the place was made by geopolitical consideration. France, because it was just close to Germany, that was in the heart of Western European countries, where there were many, many DP camps, so the recruitment of young exiles was very easy. Also France, because that was the culture of human rights, and also France, because that was a country which was the destination of emigres historically. And why Strasbourg? Because it's just next to Germany, so it's even easier to find young refugees. Strasbourg had also a very renowned university, and also the European culture was flourishing here in the Council of Europe, at that time the only European organization. The organization chart of the Free Europe University in Exile was very complicated. There was an educational corporation in the US, while this American corporation had to create a Western European branch in France for the representation, of course, in Europe. At the same time, a French association had to be set up for the legal entity of all this operation in France. This French association was which managed actually and gave funds to the university. And finally, we had the study center, which name was Collège de l'Europe Libre, so that was a French appellation. This study center was in Strasbourg in France, and it was functioning like a boarding school. So all the Free Europe fellows actually was lodged at place, and this study center was headed by an American dean, and this American dean was of course assisted by many other officials. And also there was a committee on awards and placement which was charged actually to select the student. Concerning the selection of the young refugees, there were 5 criteria. The first one is to be exile or refugee from Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland or Romania, Poland, Romania, and Yugoslavia. They had to be university-age young people. They had to have baccalaureate or other kind of qualification just to make them able to follow university studies. They had to be capable of following university courses in French at the French university. And the most important aim was just they formed them for a future leadership. So now I will quote the public announcement which was made about the study center. So these young fellows By reason of previous academic performance, character, and estimated capacity for leadership in a free society, they have to commend themselves to the University's Committee on Awards and Placement as likely to return to their countries of origin as soon as became possible and to fulfill these useful and constructive roles. The students, in exchange for the fellowship, they had 3 obligations. First of all, they had to make successful university studies, just that they could renew their fellowship. And 2 other obligations was connected to the study center. Just because the aim was to form a future leadership, they had special instructions in the Collège de l'Europe. First of all, they had national seminars, which were led by national tutors. The aim of these national seminars was to keep alive, actually, their national sentiments in exile. And second instructions was the annual conference series, which was about actual political, social, and cultural topics, actually. Just before talking in more detail about the Free Europe University Exile, I would like to emphasize a fact, what is very important, that the idea of the university was originated from a Polish exile group. So it wasn't at all the proper idea of the Free Europe Committee to launch this initiative. It came from a Paris-based Polish exile review, which name was Kultura. So thank you very much for quoting just this morning the name of Joseph Czapski and Jerzy Gidroch, who founded this journal Kultura. And this Polish group had the idea actually to create a university. They were in very close intellectual friendship with James Burham. James Burham was a very famous conservative philosopher at that time, and secretly he headed one of the branch of the Office of Policy Coordination. So this is maybe through this channel actually that the National Committee became aware of the idea or of the plan to create this university. The Free Europe Committee found very appealing actually the idea of the university, just because it fitted exactly in the Free Europe Committee policy, which of course prepared the liberation of the communist regime behind the Iron Curtain. But the National Committee of Free Europe even made an attempt to create a university without the knowledge of the Kultura group. But just because this early attempt failed, they had to connect to the Kultura, and they had to conduct the same negotiations which they began at the French Foreign Ministry. But two or 3 months later that they contacted Kultura, they completely excluded this Polish exile group actually from the whole enterprise. Officially, the Free Europe University in Exile was opened in November 1951, and it hosted approximately 200 young refugees, girls and boys, each year. Very, very soon after the launch of the university, many problems occurred at the university's life. First of all, the officials had to face to an unprecedented situation, which meant the exile body. These students they came from a very large background. Even psychologically and even academically, they wasn't able actually to follow university studies. And even they had another handicap that they couldn't even understand French lessons because they didn't have the good French level actually to understand the courses. And in this controversial situation, what to teach when the students, they hadn't have the sufficient skill actually, the skill to follow the studies. The following question raised among Free Europe University officials: what was the main aim of the university? Helping, assisting these young people to do university studies, or we wanted to form a future leadership, so their political indoctrination is much more important than to teach them French and so forth. So all this problem led to a general crisis in the history of the university, and very serious personal changes has been occurred in the life of the university. Finally, of course, it kept alive, and but the main aim of the university remained always the same: forming a future leadership. But at that time, just after this internal problem, a wider external problem occurred, and that was the challenge of the peaceful coexistence. The policy of liberation seemed to be postponed, and it was very difficult to form future leaders when they didn't know when this country will be liberated and how. I had the chance to meet to the last national tutor who was alive at that time when we met, and he said that this university was a kind of vicious circle. Each year they were just waiting that some changes would occur in Eastern Europe, so finally these young people could find some way to go back to their countries and to do some useful role, but it never happened. So at that time, the Free Europe University officials decided to change absolutely the structure of the university. And from a boarding school, they changed to an external fellowship institution. The Free Europe fellows could choose the university where they wanted to do university studies. The only obligation was that to return to the summer session and to participate at the Free Europe summer sessions. These summer lecture series were about actual political and social questions. And also, well, that was always the same idea that while we were waiting for the liberation of these countries, we would like to contribute to raise awareness of communist dangers in the free world. The Hungarian Revolution changed completely the life of the university, because the strengthening of communist regime behind the Iron Curtain made forgot absolutely to follow this university project, and this is the reason why the educational corporation was phased out definitely in 1958. I would like just to quote the public announcement about the closure, because you can understand how controversially was actually managed all this university. So it's from 1958. The Free Europe University in Exile and its companion organization, the Association, the Collège de la Livre, were organized in 1951 to assist in providing university education for young men and women originating in the Kairos behind the Iron Curtain, who had been displaced for their native lands by World War II and by the consequent communist seizure of these countries. It was recognized at that time that this project by its nature would continue only for a relatively few years. Few other organizations were then concerning themselves with giving assistance to this particular group of students. Now, after nearly 7 years, most of the young men and women so displaced have achieved their education or have reached adult life. The project on which the Free Europe University in Exile embarked in 1951 has thus reached this end. However, and that's my last however, in 1959, the Free Europe Committee itself changed its policy just in face to the challenges of the peaceful coexistence. And the new policy from 1958 was that in all captive nations, evolutionary change in political, economic and social life towards more liberal form is to be actively encouraged. This is the reason, or that was the basis, how they worked out a building bridges policy for the end of the 50s and the beginning of the 60s. The idea was to influence Eastern students who come to Western countries and to contribute actually to the gradual liberalization to their native homeland. Also, at the end of the 15th, beginning of the 16th, there is another area, actually, which gained a big importance in the Free Europe policy, and that was the area of the uncommitted countries, uncommitted area. So finally, the Free Europe Committee decided to relaunch the fellowship program from 1959, and at the same time, they organized also summer lectures, always on the same idea, just to talk about actual political, social questions, but of course, in the aim to westernize these young people. There was university students from Western European, so there was Western European students, there was Eastern European students from Eastern European countries directly who came for this summer session, and also third world students who were already in Western Europe. And controversially, what was happening in the 1960s, that these Free Europe summer lectures had to gain a very serious academic reputation at that time, but that was the detent and other budgetary question which made to abolish the division which was charged of carrying out these youth activities. So from day to another in 1965, the Free Europe Committee just decided to abolish the division and all these youth activities. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Veronika. I'm going to open it up for questions in just a moment, but I do have one question for you. Can you tell us whether there was any active intelligence presence on campus at the Free European University in Exile, both in its first incarnation and its second incarnation? Was there any direct influence?
When the university was created, the CIA just stayed behind the scenes, so it was just following what was happening in the university. But at the beginning, I was just talking about this crisis, which was occurring in the administration, and that was the time when the CIA decided actually to send an agent at place who would help to the officials actually to outline a plan for the university. So that was the reason why in the mid-50s they forgot this idea to return to homeland, and this is the reason why they tried to adapt, to adjust actually the Free Europe University's program to the international situation. So, well, actually, one of the plan maker of the university was a CIA agent, and that they were in close, well, working relationships. In the 1960s, it's another question, because that was just one person who managed all the institutions. So even the policy making was much was easier to the CIA. But in the 1960s, there was a very serious security problem actually in the summer lectures, because the presence of Eastern European refugees and third world students at the same place led to think that maybe there was some essay to sabotage actually the Free Europe University Exile, the summer sessions. So we could say that was also one reason why they wished to stop also one day to another in 1965 the summer lectures, because politically it was a very big challenge from the Soviet side.
Thank you, Veronika. I have a couple of more questions. One, I wanted to ask Marius and Francis about funding. First of all, Marius, I'm very curious as to at what point the Free Europe Committee realized that the Romanians were operating with these large amounts of independent funds while they were still patrons, they were clients, so to speak, of the Free Europe Committee. And did this actually cause their ceasing the funding, those times that they ceased to fund them? I'm just curious about that. Or
I just want to point out that even with those, with the formations of the Romanian national funds, It was happening in 1946, 1947, when Brutus Costas, for example, he announced the State Department about the existence of these funds.
Ah, so they knew it all along.
They do that. They found about that. They informed the State Department. And then the State Department was somehow concerned about that National Committee. It doesn't work properly the way how it was supposed to. And then the lack of trust, of course, cut automatically, slash the amount of money for the National Committee for the Romanian National Councils. So it was, this untrust, from the Free Europe Committee. And that's why it was back and forth, the discussions and between the two organizations. But this was, one of the cause.
It was one of the reasons.
It was one of the reasons.
So 6 million, did I understand right? 6 million Swiss francs
yes.
Were used by the Romanian National Council in
Yes.
addition to the Free European
Yes.
Committee, Free Europe Committee
yes.
funds
Yeah, and
during
besides
this period.
Yeah, and besides
That's a stunning amount.
It's a lot of money. Besides this, like I mentioned before, the Lisbon legations, the legations Romania from Lisbon, from Ankara, from Madrid, they have their own pre-existing funds before the World War II. Besides this, we have another few private funds. It's about the Nicolae Malaxa funds, which never exist. Nobody knows about those funds. Well, he was one of the most known industrialists, or in his hands, he has more than 90% of the Romanian industry before World War II. Well, he moved to the United States, and he tried to buy his freedom and his citizenship here, being involved in the politics, also being involved in the espionage, as the famous of the Copeland case, and also he gave white checks or unlimited fund to Nicolae Radescu, to General Nicolae Radescu, things which never. Nobody knows about those funds.
So there was no financial accountability, no transparency whatsoever.
Yes.
Well, I know the Czechoslovakian Committee for Free Czechoslovakia funded itself. Then my question is, after Free European Committee funding ceased, how did they fund themselves, Francis? I'm not clear on that.
As I write in my book, they relied on membership contributions, and one has to keep in mind that the situation became so financially dire that towards the end of the 70s, they even had to sell the building that they had somewhere, and then they lived from that. And throughout the 80s, they met in the Bohemian National Hall in New York City, which was at the time falling down, only to be, it was founded in the late 19th century. It was then renovated after the fall of communism because the Czech state bought it for something like, $1 or something, and then invested into all the renovations of it. Okay.
So they essentially raised funds through membership.
Membership,
Yes,
membership, and it was a modest operation, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And one has to also keep in mind that Czechoslovak money, the people who went back in 45, the money was pretty much repatriated, and there wasn't really time to get it out in 48.
Right. Well, thank you very much for clarifying that. I just have one comment to add to Jonathan's presentation, and that is I don't know how many of you are at all aware of this, but the Hungarians had a legation in Madrid, which was still the Royal Hungarian Legation. The Franco government did not recognize communist Hungary and allowed the Royal Hungarian Legation in Madrid under Ferenc Marosi to continue to operate till 1965, which was very handy for emigres because generally if you wanted to obtain, let's say, just even simple documents like birth certificates or graduation certificates or your transcripts, you never got them easily from Hungary. But this way, you sent your materials off to Marosi at the Madrid legation, and he stamped everything and created valid papers for you. So Free Europe Committee funded the Marosi and the Royal Hungarian Legation in Spain until 1965. So like the democratic legations, representatives of the Baltic states, the Hungarians continued on with the Hungarian Royal Legation in Madrid. Actually, I think in Lisbon as well, but I'm not absolutely certain of that. I'm going to open it up for questions, please.
First of all, let me congratulate for the book you have provided and you have produced. It's a wonderful book. Thank you very much. It was fascinating reading, and it was fascinating to listen to you. Thank you very much. I like that book, and I had the privilege to read it early. I like that book because it shades light on those parts of this untold story which had never been told before. So thank you very much. And I have a question to Veronika. I think you have made a point about the different aspects of the Free Europe College, but maybe one point I'm very curious about is, did it have any European dimension in a sense that it was preparing cadres, future cadres for a common European cause? Because in certain part of the historiography nowadays, Cold War is told as a part of a European project. So I would be grateful if you shed some light on this, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The European integration was a topic, actually, at the conferences during the summer series and even after in the 1960s. They had no that kind of idea, but you say that to form a future leaders for a united Europe. But the topic of European integration was, of course, in these was studied in these conferences, and also when I'm just thinking that when they founded the university, even they made a noble goal to reconciliate actually these European nations, which were very we know perfectly that wasn't as easy situation actually to work out this program with these so different nationalistic tendencies and opinions. So the European integration was just only a topic, but a very wished aim actually at the Free Europe University.
Several people spoke about émigrés in terms of various questions, like the questions emerge, who do they represent, what sort of political interest do they represent, and the ties to those political back home, questions about the role they may or may not have played in intelligence work or serving as sources of intelligence, and then the potential for serving as future leaders. And as I was listening to those stories, I was wondering if any of you have examples or can speak to the possibility of there having been what might be called the Ahmed Shalaby effect. For those of you who sort of remember from the early days of the Iraq War, Ahmed Shalaby was an Iraqi exile who had a very close ear in Washington, close ties to the defense industry, was responsible for feeding some over-optimistic intelligence about what might happen after we invaded, potentially some bad intelligence about the weapons of mass destruction, and then ultimately is sort of groomed for leadership, and then that falls by the wayside. So it's sort of this effect of one person from a country being taken to represent that country's as a source of authority and as a source of potential leadership, but really not being a particularly useful source in that case. And I wonder if you've seen similar kinds of phenomenon in your work at this earlier time in different places.
Well, as for Czechoslovakia, there wasn't really anybody from the early emigration, in my opinion, whom they considered a possible leader, In the archives, you basically see that some of the complaints that came from the side of the Americans, more specifically the NCFE or the FEC, was that this bickering basically showed the very small mindedness of a lot of these people who, without their president, Beneš, simply were lost in a political wilderness, okay? And if one, has also a look at it, the socio-political circumstances after the communist coup in Czechoslovakia changed to such an extent that really the émigrés didn't even have a chance, after 1989. The most classic example, I think, of the old emigration was when, Jiří Horák tried to reestablish, Czechoslovak social democracy. Well, it was so successful that Horák packed it in and went back to America, where he died a few years thereafter. So, it has to do, you know, I can't really see any heroes of the Czechoslovak exile or anyone whom even Washington could have been duped into thinking could be a real potential leader. You know, I mean, it's just, it's unfortunate, but, you know, they were well-meaning in a certain way. They tried to do what they did, and I would say that if anybody had any real impact, it was the later exile. Okay, that means the post-1968 exile that went into mainly Western Europe, also a bit to the States, and those are the people that had the real, yeah.
My question is, czy były badania przyszłości tych absolwentów uniwersytetu? Jakie były losy tych ludzi? Jak się spełnili w krajach ojczystych, czy też na Zachodzie? Czy ktoś się nad tym zastanawiał? Czy są jakieś opracowania na ten temat? It's clear?
Yes. The Free Europe University in Exile and its follow-up program assisted approximately more than 1,000 students, and about 85% of these more than 1,000 students was a dead wood, but that was the appellation of the Free Europe Committee. That was the opinion of the Free Europe Committee about these students. So let's say that about these 1,000 students, 800 students were just became an ordinary citizen in Western Europe. So they've been naturalized and they had an ordinary life than anybody else. But there were some very famous fellows which had a very successful professional career after. If you, just because my PhD is still on work, I wouldn't like to make more names about it, but there are even politicians now who were actually former fellows in this university. So let's say that there was some which was very successful in the studies, and he made a very big career, but the big majority had just an ordinary life after. If you want, I met a former fellow. He was a Polish former fellow, Maciej Morawski. Her father was the former ambassador, actually, to France of Poland between the war. And for example, Maciej Morawski, he was a Free Europe University fellow, and after in the 60s and the 1970s and even the 80s, he became one of the correspondents of the Free Europe, of the Radio Free Europe in the Paris bureau. So there were some former fellows who made a very career, but the big majority, they became an ordinary citizen in Western Europe.
Do you want to say anything, Marius?
Yeah, I just want to add one more thing. Besides, the Free Europe University in Paris, also the Radio Free Europe, the National Committee for Free Europe, for Free Europe, also they support the Romanian Carol First University from Paris. The university was reopened because it was functioning till the 1940 in Romania and Bucharest, and it was reopened in 1950 in Paris. And all of the funds came from the National Committee for Free Europe. And the university functioned till 1975. Some of the students from the Carol First Romanian University from Paris also, they attend the Free Europe University from Paris.
Oh.
And were able, to track some of those names. And I don't want to disclose that, but we are close, even, to get in touch with some of them live. They live in Germany, in France as well. And, just want to mention, no work has been done on this subject at all. Not a single page besides, the ones which we did in Yoletta's book, Kathy.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Marius, and I think that's a good topic for tomorrow's seminar. I do have one addition to the question, the prior question, as to influential emigres. In the Hungarian case, it was not true of the first wave. first generation of exiles, the 45 to 48 group that came out, as we say. You know, I live in San Francisco, so you don't say come out very much, but that came out. But after the 56 immigration, there were figures like General Béla Király, who was the head of the Hungarian National Guard during the Hungarian Revolution, who actually had some policy influence. And the case I'd like to point to very quickly is the case of the return of the Hungarian crown and crown regalia to the communist government of Hungary by the Kádár administration, which was a decision that was opposed by 99% of the immigration. The letters to the Kádár White House ran 99% against it. It was on Király's recommendation and one other influential historian's recommendation that the crown be returned, and that was done by the Kádár administration. So I think that's one illustration that I can think of where an emigre leader had some influence onto American policy. And I know Anya had a question.
Yeah, if I might just very briefly, I wanted also to refer to what Francis was saying. I want a second one on what you're saying. But I also want to tell you, Kenneth, that Mikołajczyk left Poland in the late 1947. He escaped Poland. He came to America, and at first it seemed like he would be the person. But then at the same time, we have a presidential crisis in London, so there's an infighting, everything is falling apart. There are 3 groups of exiles. Then come February, we have rubber stamp the fate of Czechoslovakia. So suddenly, there's no point, because it's all being sealed with an iron curtain. So there's no such Halabi effect, but what I see in a very long-term perspective is that basically by 1970s and by 1980s, where these guys are operating independently of the American funding, they don't even get the money from the National Endowment for Democracy. They're completely independent. They relied for a long time on AFL-CIO support and friends. They call them friends. But what we end up with is basically an organization of a handful of exiles who are treated as an NGO or a think tank. And as such, there is a kind of an impact I see. They do have an ear in the State Department. Usually these would be the country or regional desk. They do have people still in Congress who are putting their stuff in the congressional record. So as a think tank, or sometimes they are invited to the briefings at the State Department as among the representatives of the NGOs. And this is, we don't have the Committee for Free Iraq, we don't have Free Afghanistan. It's different because there was no use, because that was it. Okay?
And if I could add to that, 1956 changed things as well, because with the failure of the Hungarian Revolution and when the West did nothing, it basically was clear to the exiles that it was the long haul. And in 68, 69, it was a similar thing, you know, the long haul. It's not going to be a short world war, 5-6 years. It's going to be for a long time. So anybody who had any delusions of grandeur was sadly disappointed.
Any more? A couple more quick questions.
May I? Sorry.
Oh, you have that.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Thanks.
Sorry, you.
Yeah. Thanks to the panel. Just picking up on relations with Congress. Jonathan mentioned this briefly, and Anna just mentioned it again. And I'm just very curious to what extent the national councils you're talking about engaged in lobbying activities, which maybe in certain electoral areas did have a certain impact because of population density of one or other group. And also maybe they were targeting particular committees in Congress, or have you come across interesting examples with Congress as the goal?
Yeah, I think probably the quintessential example of that is the Kirsten Committee that took place in the early 1950s in order to investigate the actual annexation of the Baltic states in 1940. You know, Charles Kirsten, who was a representative from like sort of Wisconsin, had a very strong Polish constituency and was ideologically prone to ideas of liberation and like things like that. And this was an initiative of the Lithuanian American community, so not necessarily the exile community post-45, but the already existing community within the United States. But the Baltic National Committees played a big role in attempting to get testimony from Balts residing within the United States and then Europe, and that after the first round of congressional investigations took place, this then expanded to a broader investigation of all sorts of atrocities committed by the Soviet Union or basically communist governments basically around the world. So I think in the 1950s, the Kirsten Committee is kind of the best example of it, and there was very close relations that basically took place. And then from then on, I would argue that Congress became the most important arm of government for the émigré in the broad sense, as opposed to the State Department, simply due to the electoral component, yeah.
Yes, we also mustn't forget that in the later emigration, the Helsinki process and the American Congressional Committee that was involved with that, in particular, a congresswoman from my home state of New Jersey, Millicent Fenwick.
The Hungarian National Council, just very quickly, was very proactive in terms of its lobbying in Washington, and even at its initial formation prior to its affiliation with the Free Europe Committee, was actively lobbying Washington and members of Congress, and continued to do so on major issues, and had a modicum of success. And I would say their lobbying at the United Nations, of course, the committee on the question of Hungary was led by Sir Leslie Munro, but the Hungarian National Council provided a great deal of support for to prevent the seating of the Hungarian Communist delegation in the United Nations. So I think all of these national committees, to a degree, had some Washington lobbying activities. How successful they were is another question. Marius?
Nicolae Malaxa, I mentioned before, he tried to buy his freedom in his citizenship in the United States. Well, he was involved in the Nixon campaign, and it was a huge scandal because he paid for the Nixon campaign like almost more than $100,000. I don't want to know. I have a lot of details of these issues, but again, it exists. More details of those influences.
Thank you. There was another question. I saw another hand somewhere. Yes, András.
I just have a very short question. There was a moment during the Cold War when it seemed that the Cold War was over and the Soviets were the winner. This was the signature of the Helsinki Accord, at least from the perspective of these émigré circles and from the perspective of many Western analysts. So I'm particularly curious about the reaction of these Baltic émigré groups to this Helsinki process.
Yeah, that's a good question. Funny story. When I was doing some research at the Ford Library, I thought that there was a typo in the finding aid when they said that there was something like 25 to 30 boxes of stuff concerning the Baltic states. Usually you might find a folder or two. And it was all constituent mail blasting Ford for going to Helsinki to sign the final act. And ironically, Ford had a very large Latvian constituency back in Michigan. And before he left, he gave a very impassioned speech claiming that this was something, that was ultimately going to be good. And I think in the long run, after 1975, it is a little bit ironic that those who initially blasted the entire Helsinki process as basically an act of appeasement to the Soviet Union turned out to be one of their greatest weapons to use against the Soviet Union once we get to the 1980s onwards. But yeah, certainly the initial backlash was significant.
To pick up on what Jonathan just said, you know, one can't really generalize these exiles, but I know for a fact that for the Czechoslovak exile, Helsinki was a godsend. Why do I say a godsend? Because now they could really have monitors, you know, the Western governments could have monitors for human rights. The Soviet Union did not realize what they were signing with that basket dealing with human rights, you know, and because what the Soviet Union cared about was, you know, borders in Europe, right? Well, with the exception of Ruthenia, you know, the Czechs and Slovaks didn't really lose any territory, so that wasn't really an issue. But this human rights thing was an issue, and it was a godsend. I think that it was a godsend also to people who were fearing sort of a German potential in the future, German irredentism. And I'm thinking in terms of the Poles, for example, because I know that the Czechoslovak and the Polish exile in the 70s and especially in the 80s were quite closely collaborating. You know, they signed a number of, you know, documents and what have you. You know, not that it meant much because it was basically like, you know, one grandpa meeting the other, but, or, you know, some of the younger ones, it was more like one dad meeting another sort of after a soccer game and having coffee somewhere. Well, that's how it was described to me by one still living person, so who knows?
I think we need to wrap it up. We have run out of time. I just want to say very quickly, Francis' 2 books on the Council for Free Czechoslovakia are available through East European Monographs. I don't think they're out here today, but you can easily find them on Amazon. And our other 3 panelists' books on the topics on which they spoke today will be published in 2015 and 2016 by Helena History Press. So thank you very much for your attention, and we appreciate your being here today.